It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Sienna laughed as she tipped her crystal glass, watching the dark Bordeaux bloom like a bloodstain across Elena's ivory silk dress in front of the entire benefit committee. The liquid was cold, a shocking contrast to the humid heat of the ballroom, and it seeped through the delicate archival fabric Elena had spent weeks restoring. The scent of fermented grapes mixed with Sienna's cloying tuberose perfume, a fragrance so expensive it practically screamed for attention. "Oh, Elena." "I am so sorry," Sienna said, though her eyes remained fixed on her phone screen, ensuring the lighting was perfect for her live stream. She didn't look sorry, she looked victorious. "I guess some things and some people just don't belong in a room this expensive. You're practically invisible, darling. I didn't even see you standing there." Around the circular table, the elite of the city's social circle shifted. No one spoke up. Why would they? Sienna Sterling was the face of the family now, a golden girl with 3 million followers and a wardrobe that cost more than a suburban hospital. Elena was merely the help with a shared last name, the dusty librarian who spent her days in the basement archives of the Sterling estate while the rest of the world moved on. Lillian Sterling leaned forward, her diamonds catching the light of the crystal chandeliers. She didn't offer a napkin. Instead, she sighed, a sound of profound disappointment directed entirely at her eldest daughter. "Elena, really? You've ruined the mood. Look at you, you're a mess. Go to the powder room and try to be discreet. We have donors to impress." "It was an accident, Mother," Elena said, her voice a calm, level ribbon of sound. She didn't tremble, she didn't cry. She simply looked at the red stain spreading toward her waist. "An accident caused by your clunky presence," Marcus Sterling added without looking up from his steak. He adjusted his silk tie, his wedding band glinting. "Sienna is the guest of honor tonight. Try not to embarrass her further with that, whatever it is you're wearing." Elena looked down at the dress. It was a 1920s original, a piece of history she had preserved with painstaking detail. To her father and mother, it was just old clothes. To Sienna, it was a target. Sienna turned back to her phone, her voice dropping into that sugary, performative tone she used for her fans. "Anyway, guys, like I was saying, the Sterling legacy is all about elegance. Sometimes you have to deal with a little bit of clutter to get to the gold." She winked at the camera, her designer heels clicking rhythmically against the black marble floor as she walked away to find a better backdrop, leaving Elena standing in a puddle of wasted wine. Elena reached into the small, hidden pocket of her skirt. Her fingers brushed against a cold, heavy object, a brass key engraved with a singular, stylized S. It was the key to Arthur Sterling's private vault, the one the lawyers claimed didn't exist. Her grandfather had been the only one who saw her, the only one who understood that while Sienna chased the camera, Elena was the one holding the history. And history, as Elena knew better than anyone, was written by those who kept the records. She felt the weight of the key, a secret power that hummed against her thigh. For 5 years, she had played the role of the invisible daughter. She had cataloged every deed, every offshore transfer, and every dark secret her father and sister thought was buried under layers of PR. She was the architect of silence, and she had built a fortress they didn't even know they were trapped inside. "I'll go clean up," Elena said softly. She turned and walked toward the grand staircase, her movements fluid and deliberate. She could feel the eyes of the committee members on her back, pitying, dismissive, or worse, indifferent. She didn't mind. Indifference was a cloak, and she wore it better than Sienna wore couture. As she reached the shadows of the hallway, she pulled out her own phone. It wasn't a gold-plated model like her sister's, but it was encrypted. She tapped a single contact. "Julian," she said when the line connected. The name felt heavy in the quiet of the corridor. "The board meeting is in 3 days." "I'm aware," Julian Vane replied, his voice a deep, steady anchor. "The legal team has the filings ready. Are you sure about this, Elena? Once we move, there is no going back to the way things were. Your father will lose everything. Sienna's brand will be incinerated." Elena looked back at the ballroom. Through the glass doors, She saw Sienna posing for a selfie with a senator's wife, her head tilted back in a fake, glittering laugh. She saw her mother and father basking in the reflected glow of a daughter who was a hollow shell of vanity. They had spent decades treating Elena like a ghost in her own home, a servant to their reputations. She looked down at the wine stain on her ivory silk. It was a permanent mark, a reminder of the arrogance that thought it could spill whatever it wanted without consequence. "They've had their time in the sun," Elena said, her voice as cold as the marble beneath her feet. "It's time for them to see what happens when the archives are finally opened. Start the transfer. I want the locks on the penthouse changed by Monday." "Consider it done," Julian said. Elena hung up and tucked the phone away. She didn't go to the powder room to scrub the stain. Instead, she walked straight to the heavy oak doors of the exit. The night air was crisp, smelling of rain and distant jasmine. She took a deep breath, the first one that didn't feel constricted by the weight of the Sterling name. 3 days. In 72 hours, Sienna would realize that the invisible sister didn't just belong in the room. She owned the building. The next morning, the breakfast room at the Sterling estate smelled of imported espresso and the cloying, sweet scent of lilies. Elena Sterling stood at the edge of the sun-drenched conservatory, her fingers tracing the cold, jagged edge of the brass key in her pocket. She had slept for only 4 hours, but the exhaustion was a distant hum compared to the sharp, crystalline clarity of her purpose. Elena watched her sister, who sat at the head of the mahogany table. Sienna Sterling was already in full performance mode, her phone propped against a crystal vase as she live-streamed her morning routine to 500,000 strangers. She looked radiant, untouched by the malice she had spat the night before. "Elena, don't just stand there like a ghost," Sienna said, not looking away from her screen. Her voice was sugary for the camera, but the underlying edge was a serrated blade. "I need the inventory list for the vault by noon, and tell the kitchen the croissants were dry. It's embarrassing." Marcus Sterling lowered his morning paper, offering a curt nod of agreement. "Your sister has a big week, Elena. The Founders' Gala is on Thursday, and the Sterling name needs to be synonymous with perfection. If you can't manage the household staff properly, perhaps you should move into the servants' quarters permanently. It would certainly save us the pretense of you being a member of this family." Lillian Sterling didn't even look up from her tablet. "She's right, Marcus. And Elena, I've decided Sienna will be using your archival office as her dressing room for the event. Your little projects can wait in the basement. It's not as if that old paper is generating any revenue." The air in the room felt thick, tasting of old money and new betrayals. Elena felt the familiar heat of indignation rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down, letting it fuel the cold engine of her plan. She thought of the documents she had spent years digitizing in secret, the ones Arthur Sterling had hidden behind the family's public facade. "I'll start moving my things immediately," Elena said, her voice a calm, flat line. Sienna smirked, flicking a stray crumb off her silk robe. "Good. Oh, and I took that vintage gold watch collection from the archive safe this morning. I'm giving the Podek to my manager. It's just gathering dust, and he actually does something for this family's status." That was the second rage spike of the morning. Those watches hadn't been mere accessories. They were Arthur's personal history, promised to Elena in a handwritten note that her parents had conveniently lost after the funeral. Elena didn't flinch. She pulled her phone from her pocket and sent a pre-formatted message to Julian Vane. "The assets are being liquidated without authorization. Trigger the freeze on the primary trust. Now, is there a problem?" Marcus asked, his eyes narrowing as he noticed the slight tilt of Elena's head. "No problem at all," she replied, her thumb brushing the screen as Julian's reply flashed. "Done. The Sterling Trust is now under audit. They have no idea they're spending money that isn't theirs." The secret was a heavy, delicious weight. Her father believed he was the master of the Sterling fortune, but Arthur had been a man of profound foresight. He had seen Marcus's greed and Sienna's vanity decades ago. The trust wasn't a gift, it was a conditional lease, and the conditions had just been violated. Elena wasn't just the archivist. She was the sole beneficiary of the reversionary clause. "I'm going to the vault now," Elena said, turning toward the door. The sound of her sensible heels on the marble floor was a steady, rhythmic countdown. "Make sure you polish the sterling silver while you're down there," Sienna called out, her laughter echoing through the conservatory. "You should get used to the work. After the gala, I'm thinking of hiring a real assistant. You're just so drab." Elena paused at the heavy oak doors. She looked back at the three people who had spent a lifetime making her feel small in her own home. "The gala is in 72 hours, Elena said, her voice dropping an octave. "I'd suggest you enjoy the croissants while you can still afford the flour. Thursday is going to be a very long night for all of you." She stepped out before Sienna could respond, the heavy doors clicking shut with the finality of a prison cell. The countdown had begun, and the sterling legacy was about to meet its true owner. 2 days later, the rain-slicked windows of the Vane building overlooked a city that had no idea the Sterling Empire was about to be decapitated. Elena Sterling sat in a chair of butter-soft cognac leather, the scent of cedarwood and old parchment grounding her as she watched the man across the desk. Julian Vane didn't look like a real estate titan. He looked like a predator who had traded his claws for a bespoke Italian suit. He slid a heavy, wax-sealed envelope across the mahogany surface. The sound of the paper dragging against the wood was loud in the silent office, a tactile promise of the carnage to come. "It's all there, Elena," Julian said, his voice a low, rhythmic rumble. "The original codicil my father witnessed for Arthur Sterling. It wasn't just a will, it was a failsafe. Your grandfather knew exactly what Marcus and Lillian would become the moment he was gone. He knew they would treat you as a shadow while they let Sienna bleed the estate dry." Elena reached out, her fingers brushing the cool, thick vellum. She felt a surge of cold electricity at the contact. This was the weapon. Inside this envelope was the legal proof that the Sterling Trust, the house, the accounts, the very air her family breathed, didn't belong to her father or her sister. It belonged to her. "The forensic audit is attached," Julian continued, leaning back. "Sienna has been skimming from the foundation for 3 years. She thinks she's been clever, but she's left a trail of digital breadcrumbs a mile wide. She's used the charitable funds to pay for her influencer lifestyle, her designer wardrobe, and that ridiculous gala she's throwing on Thursday." Elena opened the folder, her eyes scanning the columns of red ink. The sheer audacity of the theft made her pulse quicken, but her face remained a mask of marble. She spent $4 million of money meant for underprivileged arts programs on herself. "And your parents signed off on every administrative expense she requested," Julian added, a grim smile touching his lips. "They've essentially helped her rob themselves. But they didn't rob themselves, Elena. They robbed you. As the sole beneficiary of the foundation, you are the one she's been stealing from." 48 hours, Elena whispered, the words tasting like iron. "I want everything ready for the reveal. I want the transfer of titles, the freeze on the credit lines, and the eviction notices drafted. I want them to realize they are guests in a house they no longer own." Julian nodded, his eyes gleaming with a shared, dark anticipation. "My legal team is on standby. The moment you give the signal at the gala, the Sterling legacy ends. Or rather, it finally begins with you." The transition back to the Sterling estate felt like stepping into a gilded cage that was already beginning to rust. As Elena entered the grand foyer, the air was thick with the cloying scent of lilies and expensive hairspray. The house was a hive of frantic activity. Caterers moved like ants, and decorators were draping the marble banisters in silver silk. Sienna Sterling stood at the center of the chaos, her voice a shrill whip cracking over the heads of 2 exhausted delivery drivers. She was draped in a robe of crimson silk, her blonde hair pinned up in a style that screamed of self-importance. "No, you idiots! The floral arrangements go in the conservatory, not the hallway," Sienna screamed, her face flushing a mottled pink. She turned as she saw Elena, her eyes narrowing with instant, practiced contempt. "Oh, look. The house mouse has returned from her little errands. Did you manage to find a dress that doesn't look like it was salvaged from a Victorian funeral, or are you planning to embarrass me in front of the governor?" Elena didn't flinch. She felt the weight of the envelope in her bag, a secret shield against the vitriol. "The gala will be unforgettable, Sienna. I've made sure of it." Sienna stepped closer, the smell of her perfume, something floral and obscenely expensive, filling the space between them. She reached out and flicked the lapel of Elena's modest gray coat. "You really are a bore, aren't you? You have all the sterling resources at your disposal, and you choose to look like a librarian on a budget. It's a good thing I'm the face of this family. People would think we were paupers if they only saw you." She paused, her gaze dropping to Elena's neck. A cruel smirk curled her lips. "By the way, I took the liberty of borrowing that old sapphire pendant of yours. The one Grandpa Arthur gave you. It matches my eyes perfectly for the second act of the evening. Don't bother looking for it. I've already had the jeweler reset it into a new setting. It looks much better on someone who actually knows how to wear jewelry." A rage spike, sharp and hot, flared in Elena's chest. That pendant had been the last thing Arthur had given her before he died. It wasn't about the stones. It was the only piece of her grandfather she had left. "You stole it," Elena said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy level. "I improved it," Sienna corrected, waving a dismissive hand as she turned back to the decorators. "Consider it a tax for living here for free. Now go find something to do in the kitchen. The silver won't polish itself, and I need this house perfect for my big night." Elena watched her sister walk away, the crimson silk trailing behind her like a smear of blood on the marble. She reached into her bag, her hand closing around the wax seal of the will. The countdown was no longer 72 hours. It was 48. She looked up at the portrait of Arthur Sterling hanging in the gallery, his painted eyes seeming to watch the destruction of his legacy with a quiet, knowing approval. Elena didn't feel like a mouse anymore. She felt like a storm that was finally making landfall. "Enjoy the house, Sienna," Elena whispered into the empty foyer. "Enjoy every second of it, because in 2 days, you won't even own the shoes on your feet." She turned and walked toward her small room in the east wing, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic promise of the karma that was already knocking at the door. The architect was finished with the blueprints. It was time to tear the building down. The morning before the Centennial Gala arrived with a biting, metallic chill that the manor's ancient heating system couldn't quite suppress. Elena Sterling sat in the solarium, the rhythmic clink of a silver spoon against her porcelain teacup, the only steady sound in a house vibrating with frantic energy. The air was thick with the cloying scent of thousands of imported white lilies, a fragrance Sienna had insisted upon despite their mother's allergies. "Move those crates to the East Gallery, not the foyer." Sienna Sterling's voice shrilled from the hallway, cutting through the morning calm like a jagged blade. She swept into the solarium, her silk robe billowing behind her. She didn't look at her sister. She looked at the reflection of the room in the glass walls, checking her own silhouette. "Elena, why are you sitting there like a statue? The caterers are lost, and the florist is claiming we owe a second deposit. Handle it." Elena took a slow sip of her tea, the warmth a sharp contrast to the cold calculations settling in her chest. She didn't rise. "The florist has been paid exactly what the contract stipulated, Sienna. Perhaps if you hadn't redirected the gala's flower budget toward that new jewelry set, there wouldn't be a discrepancy." Sienna froze, her eyes narrowing as she finally turned to face her sister. She let out a short, mocking laugh, the sound brittle and condescending. "My jewelry is an investment in the Sterling brand. Your little archival project, however, is a drain. Honestly, I don't know why Marcus and Lillian let you keep playing librarian in the basement. It's pathetic." "The archives aren't just paper, Sienna," Elena said, her voice dropping to a level of terrifying calm. She felt the heavy, cold weight of the brass key in her pocket, the key to the vault that now held the amended will. "They are the foundation of everything you're standing on. You should be careful. Foundations have a way of shifting when they've been neglected for too long." Sienna rolled her eyes, stepping closer until the scent of her expensive, musky perfume overwhelmed the lilies. "Is that a threat from you?" "You've spent your life in the shadows of this house, Elena. You're a ghost. And tomorrow night, when I'm announced as the head of the Sterling Foundation, you'll finally be a ghost with an eviction notice." I'm merely suggesting you enjoy the house today, Elena replied, her gaze unwavering. Walk through the halls, touch the walls, truly appreciate the view from the balcony. It's a beautiful legacy. It would be a shame if you realized its value only as it was slipping through your fingers. Sienna scoffed, waving a manicured hand dismissively. You're delusional. Go fix the florist's mess. I have a fitting. She turned on her heel and marched away, her designer slippers silent on the marble she believed she owned. From the shadows of the arched doorway, Julian Vane stepped forward. He had been silent, a witness to the exchange, his tailored suit as dark and sharp as his expression. He watched Sienna disappear before turning his attention to Elena. He noted the way her hands remained perfectly steady, the way the sunlight caught the steel in her gray eyes. She has no idea, does she? Julian asked, his voice a low rumble. Arrogance is a blindfold, Julian, Elena said, finally standing. She smoothed the front of her modest wool dress. She thinks she's the lead in a play. She doesn't realize the theater has already been sold. The legal transfers are complete, Julian said, stepping closer. The board members have all received their special invitations for the private session before the toast. Marcus and Lillian think it's a surprise tribute to Arthur. They have no reason to suspect the documents they're signing are anything but ceremonial. Elena nodded, her mind already moving to the final sequence of the countdown. And the digital records. Locked and ready to sync with the hall's projectors the moment you give the signal, he confirmed. He looked at her with a newfound respect, a flicker of something that bordered on awe. You're remarkably calm for someone about to dismantle a dynasty. I'm not dismantling it, Elena corrected him, her voice echoing slightly in the glass room. I'm reclaiming it. Arthur didn't build this for her greed. He built it for the work. Tomorrow, the work begins again. She walked past him, her steps echoing with a rhythmic, heavy finality. She headed toward the basement stairs, leaving the scent of lilies and the chaos of Sienna's vanity behind. In the quiet of the archives, she pulled out the final folder. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, bloody shadows across the estate grounds. 24 hours. Elena reached out and turned off the desk lamp, plunging the room into darkness. She didn't need the light anymore. She knew exactly where every piece of the trap was laid, and for the first time in her life, she slept with the deep, peaceful slumber of a woman who knew that by this time tomorrow, the Sterling name would finally mean something real again. She just had to wait for the sun to rise on the last day of Sienna's reign. The evening of the Ironwood Gala arrived with a heavy, expectant stillness that seemed to settle over the Sterling estate like a shroud. Elena Sterling stood before the floor-length mirror in the archives, but she wasn't looking at her reflection. She was looking at the small, velvet-lined box on the desk. Inside sat the Ironwood signet, Arthur Sterling's personal seal, a heavy gold ring that hadn't seen the light of day since his funeral. She didn't put it on. Instead, she slipped it into the hidden pocket of her charcoal silk gown, feeling its cool, unforgiving weight against her hip. The door to the archives swung open with a violent thud, the scent of cloying tuberose perfume flooding the room before the intruder even spoke. Sienna Sterling stood in the doorway, a vision of calculated, expensive excess in a gown of shimmering crimson that looked more like a costume than formal wear. She held a glass of amber liquid in one hand, her eyes scanning the room with a look of practiced disgust. Still hiding in the basement, Elena. She sneered, her voice dripping with the casual cruelty that had become her trademark. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her drink, her gaze landing on the modest cut of her sister's dress. I suppose it's for the best. You always did have a talent for blending into the shadows. It saves me the embarrassment of having to explain why my sister looks like the help at our own family's most important night. Elena didn't flinch. She met her sister's gaze with a calm that seemed to unsettle the other woman. The shadows are where the truth usually hides, Sienna. You should be careful. The lights in the ballroom are very bright tonight. Sienna laughed, a sharp, jagged sound that grated against the quiet of the room. The lights are for me. They're for the cameras, the donors, and the legacy I'm about to solidify. While you've been playing with dusty papers, I've been securing our future. By the end of this night, The Sterling name will belong to me in every way that matters. She stepped closer, the rustle of her silk sounding like a warning. Don't get in my way, Elena. I've already told Marcus and Lillian to have security keep an eye on you. One word out of place, and you'll be escorted out before the first course is served. She didn't wait for a response. She turned on her heel, her red train snapping behind her like a whip. Elena watched her go, the silence of the archives returning, though it felt different now. It felt like the breath held before a plunge. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the cold gold of the signet ring. The countdown had reached its final hour. The transition from the quiet basement to the grand ballroom was a sensory assault. The air was thick with the smell of expensive gardenias and the sharp, metallic tang of high-end champagne. A string quartet played in the corner, their music nearly drowned out by the rhythmic, overlapping chatter of the city's elite. Marcus and Lillian Sterling stood near the entrance, a perfectly curated tableau of old-money grace. Marcus adjusted his cuffs, his face a mask of stern pride, while Lillian leaned in to whisper a greeting to a passing senator, her smile never reaching her eyes. Elena moved through the crowd like a ghost. She saw the way the guests looked at her, the brief, flickering recognition followed by a swift dismissal. To them, she was the quiet one, the disappointment, the shadow that followed the brilliant, vibrant light of Sienna. She felt the weight of their judgment, but tonight it didn't sting. It felt like armor. "The stage is set," a voice murmured near her ear. She didn't turn to see Julian Vane. He stood a few feet away, seemingly engrossed in a conversation with a real estate developer, but his focus was entirely on her. He looked every bit the titan he was, his tuxedo perfectly tailored, his presence commanding the space around him. "The documents are in the hands of the legal team at the back of the room," Julian continued, his voice barely a breath. "The digital feed is synced. All we're waiting for is the toast." "She's going to claim the foundation," Elena replied, her eyes fixed on Sienna, who was currently holding court in the center of the room. "She thinks she's announcing the merger and her appointment as sole trustee." "Let her climb as high as she wants," Julian said, a small, dangerous smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "The fall is always more spectacular from the peak." He moved away before anyone could notice their connection, leaving Elena alone in the sea of silk and diamonds. She watched as Sienna stepped toward the small stage at the front of the room, her movements practiced and predatory. Her sister caught her eye for a split second, a look of pure, unadulterated triumph flashing across her face. Sienna signaled to the waitstaff, and the room began to quiet as the clinking of crystal against silver signaled the beginning of the end. Marcus stepped up first, his voice booming with the practiced authority of a man who believed he held all the cards. "Friends, colleagues, family," he began, his hand resting briefly on Sienna's shoulder. "Tonight, we celebrate not just the history of the Sterling name, but its future. My daughter, Sienna, has worked tirelessly to ensure that her grandfather's vision remains intact." Elena felt a surge of cold fury at the lie, but she channeled it into the stillness of her posture. She saw the way the witnesses leaned in, the lawyers, the socialites, the people who had enabled the theft of her life for years. They were all there, ready to applaud the fraud. Sienna took the microphone, her smile radiant under the spotlight. "Thank you, Father," she said, her voice amplified and honeyed. "Grandfather Arthur always said that a legacy isn't something you inherit, it's something you earn. And tonight, I am proud to announce a new era for the Sterling Foundation, one where I will personally oversee every asset, every property, and every dream he left behind." She paused for dramatic effect, her eyes sweeping the room until they landed on Elena. The arrogance in her gaze was a physical weight. "There are some who thought this day would never come," Sienna continued, her tone shifting to a mock-sympathetic lilt. "Some who thought they could hide in the past, but the future belongs to those who have the courage to take it." She raised her glass, the crystal catching the light like a jagged tooth. "To the new Sterling legacy. To me." The room erupted in polite applause, the sound of 100 hands sealing a lie. Elena stood perfectly still as the guests began to cheer. She reached into her pocket one last time, her fingers closing around the signet ring. She felt the pulse of the room, the peak of the arrogance, the absolute certainty of her sister's victory. She caught Julian's eye across the room. He gave a single, imperceptible nod. Elena stepped forward, moving toward the tech booth where the gala's commemorative slideshow was supposed to begin. The countdown was over. The lights were indeed very bright, and it was time for the shadows to speak. The tech booth smelled of heated plastic and ozone, a cramped sanctuary of monitors and tangled cables that overlooked the glittering ballroom. Elena felt the hum of the cooling fans vibrating through the floorboards, a low, mechanical pulse that matched the steady beat of her own heart. The technician started to protest as she stepped into his space, his hand reaching for the soundboard, but a heavy shadow fell over him. Julian stood in the doorway, his presence a silent, immovable wall. He didn't say a word. He simply looked at the man, and the technician's hand dropped. Elena didn't hesitate. She pulled the drive from her pocket and slotted it into the main console. On the monitors, the Sterling Legacy slideshow, a curated lie of Sienna's filtered vacations and stolen accolades, froze. Elena's fingers moved with the precision of an archivist handling a fragile relic. With a single keystroke, she overrode the system. In the ballroom below, the upbeat music died with a jarring screech of electronic feedback. The laughter of the 100 guests faltered, replaced by a confused, expectant silence. Elena looked through the glass and saw her sister. Sienna was still standing on the stage, her glass raised, a look of mild annoyance flickering across her face as she waited for her tribute to resume. Then the giant screen behind her flickered to life. It wasn't a photo of a gala or a private jet. It was a grainy, high-definition recording of a hospital room. The room went so quiet that Elena could hear the faint whir of the projector above her head. Arthur Sterling's voice, thin but unmistakable, filled the hall. "I, Arthur Sterling, being of sound mind, declare this my final act of guardianship," the recording played. The image shifted to a legal document, the camera panning over the bold, black ink of the true will. "My granddaughter, Elena, has protected the soul of this family while others sought only to scavenge its remains. To Sienna, I leave nothing but the truth of her own character. To Elena, I leave the keys to the kingdom." The screen shifted again. This wasn't a video. It was a scrolling ledger of bank statements. Red highlights tracked the systematic drainage of the family trust. Hundreds of thousands of dollars funneled into offshore accounts and influencer marketing firms, all signed with Sienna's digital thumbprint. Sienna's face underwent a violent, silent transformation. The smug, porcelain mask of the Sterling successor didn't just crack, it disintegrated. Her eyes, usually narrowed with calculated malice, stretched into wide, frantic circles of white, darting toward the screen and back to the crowd like a trapped animal. The vibrant flush of her triumph drained away, replaced by a sickly gray pallor that made her expensive foundation look like caked ash. Her jaw hung slack, her lips trembling as she tried to form a denial that her throat refused to release. Her posture, once rigid with unearned pride, slumped as if her very bones had turned to liquid under the weight of 1,000 judging eyes. She looked small, not the petite, delicate socialite she pretended to be, but a hollowed-out fraud exposed in the harsh light of her own greed. "Shut it off," Marcus Sterling's voice boomed from the front table, but it lacked its usual authority. He was staring at the screen, his face a mask of purple-hued rage and dawning horror. Beside him, Lillian had collapsed into her chair, her hand clutching the pearls at her throat so tightly the string looked ready to snap. Elena stepped out of the booth and onto the balcony overlooking the stage. She gripped the cold, heavy signet ring in her palm, the gold edges biting into her skin. She didn't shout. She didn't have to. The microphone at the podium was still live, picking up the frantic, shallow gasps of her sister below. "You spent 5 years telling everyone I was the help, Sienna," Elena said, her voice amplified, echoing off the marble walls with the weight of a gavel. Sienna spun around, looking up at the balcony. Her hands were shaking so violently that the champagne in her glass slopped over the rim, staining her designer gown. The witnesses, the board members, the investors, the socialites who had laughed at Sienna's jokes 10 minutes ago were already moving. They weren't moving toward her. They were stepping back, creating a wide, empty circle around the stage as if Sienna's failure were contagious. "You told me I didn't belong in this room," Elena continued, her tone as calm as a winter morning. "But you forgot one thing. I don't just belong in this room, I own the building. And as of 5 minutes ago, Julian has filed the injunction. Your accounts are frozen. The house is being reclaimed. You're not the legacy, Sienna. You're the debt." Elena didn't wait for a response. She didn't stay to watch the security team Julian had prearranged step toward the stage. She turned her back on the chaos, the sound of her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic retreat against the floor. She had spent a lifetime in the shadows of their lies. It was time to see what the world looked like in the light. The silence that followed Elena's departure was more deafening than the gala's orchestra had ever been. In the center of the ballroom, the air seemed to drop 10 degrees as the socialites and investors processed the wreckage of the Sterling reputation. Sienna Sterling remained on the stage, a solitary, trembling figure under the relentless glare of the spotlights. She looked less like an heiress and more like a ghost caught in the act of haunting. Sienna's features didn't just fall, they seemed to dissolve. The calculated, porcelain mask she had spent years perfecting cracked, revealing a frantic, hollow-eyed desperation underneath. Her skin turned a sickly, translucent gray, making the expensive bronze contour on her cheekbones look like streaks of dried mud. Her mouth hung open, her lower lip caught in a rhythmic, uncontrolled twitch that made her look suddenly, jarringly frail. The arrogance that usually held her spine rigid evaporated, leaving her slumped, her chest heaving in shallow, jagged gasps as she stared at the digital display of her own financial ruin. It was the visceral collapse of a woman watching her entire reality turn to ash in the span of a heartbeat. Julian Vane stepped into the vacuum of the stage, his presence radiating the cold, clinical authority of a predator who had already won. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked only at the trembling woman before him. He pulled a thick vellum folder from his jacket, the heavy paper snapping in the quiet room like a gunshot. "The injunction is comprehensive," Julian said, his voice amplified by the microphone Sienna was still clutching with white-knuckled fingers. "The Sterling estate, the primary residence on Fifth Avenue, and all subsidiary holdings associated with the trust have been placed under the direct control of the majority shareholder. Effective immediately, your access to all accounts is terminated. You are a guest in this building, Sienna, and your invitation has just expired." A collective gasp rippled through the room. The board members, men who had toasted to Sienna's health only 20 minutes prior, were already huddled in a tight circle, their backs turned to the stage as they checked their phones. The socialites were even faster. They moved in a synchronized wave, stepping back toward the exits, their silk gowns rustling like dry leaves. No one offered a hand. No one called out her name. The vacuum around the stage widened until Sienna stood in a literal desert of polished marble. "This is a mistake," Marcus Sterling's voice boomed from the front row, though it lacked its usual resonance. He scrambled toward the stage, his face a mottled purple, his expensive silk tie loosened at the throat. He looked at Julian, then at the crowd, trying to find a friendly face in a sea of cold shoulders. "Elena is emotional. She's overreacting. My daughter." "Your daughter is a thief, Marcus," Julian interrupted, his tone as sharp as a scalpel. "And you are an accomplice to the erasure of Arthur Sterling's true intent. The audit is already underway. I'd suggest you find a lawyer who doesn't mind working for a client with zero liquidity." Lillian Sterling stood frozen by the buffet, her hand still hovering over a crystal bowl of caviar. She looked at her husband, then at the daughter she had spent a lifetime grooming to be a queen. When a security guard in a charcoal suit stepped toward her, Lillian didn't scream. She simply set her champagne flute down on the table with a trembling hand and began to unpin the diamond brooch from her lapel, her eyes darting around the room for an exit that wouldn't require her to pass the people she had looked down on for decades. Sienna finally found her voice, but it was a thin, ragged thing. "You can't do this. I am the face of this brand. I am a Sterling." "You were a Sterling," Julian corrected, leaning in close enough that only she could hear the finality in his words. "Now you're just a tenant behind on the rent, and the landlord wants you out." At the back of the ballroom, near the heavy oak doors, Elena stood for one last moment. She had replaced her gala heels with a pair of simple, flat shoes she'd kept in the car, and the physical shift felt like a reclamation of her own soul. The smell of the expensive lilies in the foyer no longer felt like a suffocating weight. It just smelled like a room that needed to be cleaned. She watched as the security team Julian had coordinated began to usher her family toward the side exits. There was no shouting, no dramatic struggle, just the quiet, systematic removal of a stain. Marcus was arguing with a man half his age who was firmly holding his elbow. Lillian was walking with her head down, her shoulders hunched as if trying to disappear into her own fur coat. And Sienna was still on the stage, staring at the empty ballroom, her hand reaching out for a social world that had already forgotten she existed. Elena felt a strange, hollow peace. The rage that had fueled her for years hadn't vanished. It had simply done its job and retired. She pulled her phone from her pocket and saw a single message from the head of the archival team she had secretly funded for months. "The vault is secured. Every piece of Arthur's true legacy is accounted for." Elena didn't smile. She simply turned and walked out into the cool night air. Behind her, the lights of the Sterling Gala began to flicker and die, one circuit at a time, until the building was as dark as the lies that had built it. She didn't look back at the wreckage. She had spent enough time in the dark. She wanted to see what the morning looked like when she didn't owe it an apology. 6 months had passed since the lights went out at the Sterling Gala, but the silence that followed had been the loudest thing Elena Sterling had ever heard. The scandal hadn't just broken. It had shattered the family name into a million jagged pieces that no amount of public relations could glue back together. Elena stood in the center of the newly inaugurated Sterling Archival Institute, the air smelling of filtered oxygen and the faint, sweet scent of beeswax used to preserve the mahogany shelves. This was the sanctuary she had built from the wreckage, a place where history was protected, not fabricated. The climate control system hummed with a low, expensive vibration, a sound of stability that her childhood had never known. The heavy glass doors at the end of the hall hissed open. Elena didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The frantic, uneven click of heels, one of them slightly worn down, judging by the rhythm, told the story before a word was spoken. Sienna Sterling looked like a ghost of the woman who had once commanded millions of followers. The designer silk had been replaced by a generic wool coat that pilled at the sleeves, and her skin, once glowing from weekly $1,000 facials, looked gray and papery under the harsh LED lights. She clutched a cheap faux leather handbag as if it were a life preserver. "They're taking the penthouse, Elena," Sienna said, her voice cracking. There was no greeting, no apology, just the same reflexive entitlement that had defined her entire life. "The bank sent the notice this morning. Dad is. He's in a state. He won't even come out of the guest room at the club." Elena turned slowly, resting her hand on the cold marble of the main display case. Inside lay Arthur Sterling's original journals, the ink dark and defiant. "The club. I thought Marcus was asked to resign his membership months ago." Sienna flinched. The color that rose to her cheeks wasn't a healthy blush. It was the hot, blotchy red of public shame. "We're staying in the staff quarters. Lillian is. She's selling her vintage Chanel collection on some resale app just to cover the legal fees for the fraud investigation. You have to stop this. You won the company, you won the house. Isn't that enough?" "I didn't win anything, Sienna," Elena said, her voice as calm and steady as a heartbeat. "I simply stopped paying for the lies. The bank is taking the penthouse because the mortgage was secured against assets that didn't belong to Marcus. The fraud investigation is happening because you spent 3 years reporting stolen items to insurance that you actually sold to private collectors. I didn't write those police reports. You did, every time you signed your name to a lie." Sienna took a step forward, her eyes darting around the prestigious hall. She looked at the gold leaf lettering on the walls and the security guards standing at attention. The realization that Elena was the master of this world, a world of substance and truth, seemed to physically bow her shoulders. Her mouth opened, then closed, her lips trembling. She looked like she wanted to scream, to throw a tantrum, but there was no audience left to perform for. The influencers had moved on, the friends had blocked her number, and the Sterling name was now a cautionary tale taught in ethics classes. "I have nowhere to go," Sienna whispered. It was the first honest thing she had said in 20 years. "There is a small apartment in the valley," Elena replied, pulling a single brass key from her pocket and placing it on the marble. "It's clean, it's quiet. The rent is paid for 6 months. After that, you'll need to find a way to support yourself. I've heard the local library is looking for filing clerks. It's honest work." Sienna stared at the key. The face slap wasn't a physical blow, but a social execution. To go from a penthouse overlooking the park to a one-bedroom in the valley was a death of a different kind. Her hand shook as she reached out, her fingers brushing the marble before she snatched the key and fled, the sound of her uneven heels echoing like a dying pulse until the doors hissed shut. Julian Vane stepped out from the shadows of the north wing a moment later, his tailored suit a sharp contrast to the hollowed-out woman who had just left. He looked at Elena with a mixture of professional respect and something softer, something like concern. "The final transfer of the estate is complete," Julian said, handing her a leather-bound folder. "Marcus and Lillian have signed the NDA and the waiver of all future claims. They're moving to a small rental in Florida tomorrow. It's over, Elena. The legacy is secured." Elena nodded, but the victory didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like a closing. She walked to the window, looking out at the city where she had once been a shadow in her own family's home. She had the wealth, she had the archives, and she had the truth. But as she looked at the empty chair in Arthur's restored office, she felt the weight of what justice had cost her. She had cut out the rot, but in doing so, she had become the last of a dying tree. She was no longer the girl who owed the morning an apology. She was the woman who owned the dawn, even if she had to watch it rise alone. Elena leaned her forehead against the cool glass, watching the sun dip below the horizon, finally at peace with the wreckage she had left behind.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.